Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be looking at the journey the Declaration of Independence went on after it was signed, all the way up to its current home in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The Declaration of Independence, our founding document, began its life in the Pennsylvania State House, written in, quote, large legible hand, by a scribe named Timothy Matlack. Timothy was tasked with laying out the text on the parchment, determining what the margins would be, and making sure to leave enough space at the bottom for signatures. The parchment chosen was 29.5 inches by 24 inches. There is evidence that the parchment itself was actually a bit bigger when the document was written, as there is variation in the clean and dirty edges, as well as there being evidence of some trimming over the years, perhaps to prepare the document for display in years past. The ink used on the document is something known as iron gall ink, which was a common ink used in the time the Declaration was written. The ink was made up of tannic acid, iron, and some kind of binder like gum arabic. The ink would be light in color when it was applied and would darken over time to a purplish black color, and as the ink ages, it will eventually turn into a warm brown. The document itself, in its current state, has very little of the original ink left on it. In areas that the ink was applied more heavily, like the title, the ink has flecked off due to rolling of the document over time. Additionally, over the course of the document's life, there have been times when the Declaration was subject to wet transfer copying that would have resulted in the loss of ink. The wet transfer way of copying text had been invented by James Watt, who, while not particularly enjoying his time handwriting copies of his business letters, came up with a way to copy his letters without handwriting. To do this, Watt used a special kind of copying ink, a damp sheet of copying paper, topped with a clean sheet of oiled backing paper. This deck would be pressed between two felt-covered boards and pressed through a brass roller, with the end result being a copy of the original document. The Declaration would have been subject to this kind of copying in the 1820s, but before then the document traveled far and wide, traveling with the Continental Congress, across land, and even across the ocean during the Revolutionary War. Even when it was in the hands of the newly minted Department of State, the document continued to travel as the capital moved. It is quite likely that the document sat rolled up for long stretches of time, sometimes even being crushed while it was rolled up, and it could have even been folded to fit into various satchels along its travels. After the War of 1812, there started to be talk of having printed images of the Declaration created to share with the country, as relatively few people had actually seen the Declaration. In 1818, penman Benjamin Owen Tyler created a, quote, embellished calligraphic text of the Declaration with facsimiles, or exact copies of the signatures at the bottom of the Declaration. At this time, it was noted at how the, quote, hand of time had affected the document, alluding to the physical state of the document. In 1819, a Philadelphia publisher, John Binns, published a large engraving of the text of the Declaration, also with facsimile signatures. Both of these copies had the wording of the Declaration and the signatures, but the actual document had not been represented to its fullest extent. In the mid-1820s, John Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State at the time, decided to have a full copy of the Declaration created. William Stone was commissioned to create a full-size image on copperplate. The copperplate took several years to make, and the commissioned engravings were dated to July 4th, 1823. Prior to the creation of the exact replica, anyone who wanted to could enter John Quincy Adams' office and ask to see the Declaration of Independence. It wouldn't be until after this copy was created that this practice would stop. It is thought that in all three copies, the wet transfer method was used on the signatures, as there is significant wear on the signature. Adams had the forethought to create an exact copy to limit the handling of the document as the years went on, but he could not have predicted the damage to be done to the Declaration while it was on exhibit. In 1841, the Declaration would begin its nearly consistent 50 years of exhibition display. Originally on exhibit in the new Patent Office building, the Declaration was hung in a simple frame in what was deemed to be a fireproof building. Unfortunately, the frame was hung on a wall that had direct sunlight from a skylight every day. The 35 years of consistent light exposure did numbers to the document. The ink had officially turned the warm pale brown that it would have eventually become, and the damaging effects of excess light was just something that was not known at the time. After 35 years in the Patent Office building, the Declaration spent 1 year at Independence Hall and 17 years in the State Department Library, again in uncontrolled conditions. In 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant had approved sending the Declaration to Philadelphia to be displayed. Nearly 10 million people saw the Declaration while it was on display in Philadelphia, but many were shocked at how poor the condition was of the document. At this point, many people were familiar with the stone engraving, which gives a rather robust look at the founding document. Seeing just how the document had deteriorated over time led to many noting the faded ink, and some even commenting on the signatures looking effaced or even illegible. With all this feedback about the poor condition of the document, in August of 1876, while it was still on display in Philadelphia, a joint resolution of Congress passed that called for a joint commission of the heads of the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and the Interior Department to look into restoring the ink. Coming off its display in Philadelphia, the Declaration was then put on display in the State, War, and Navy building to be put on display in the Department Library and another building touted as being fireproof. The Joint Commission that had been put in place to try to come up to a solution about the degraded ink spent some time in the 1800s trying to determine if it was even appropriate to try to restore the ink. It was argued in 1881 that there should be no attempts to try to restore the ink, and it was recommended that the Declaration be put into dark storage and that no further copies be made. In 1894, the decision was made that the original Declaration would no longer be on display, and a facsimile would be put on display instead. The Declaration itself would be stored flat in a steel case. The original would be accessed occasionally and was even photographed in 1898 for an issue of the Ladies' Home Journal. In the caption, the state of the document was addressed, stating that the content was still legible and that the signatures had been blurred over time due to excessive light exposure. In 1903, the first thorough report of the condition of the Declaration was prepared. There was evidence of rolling and folding, the diminished ink from press copying, and fading from the excessive light exposure, and a lack of mold or any active deterioration. There was no evidence noted of tide lines or water damage. It was recommended that the Declaration continue to be stored in a dark, dry place and that it should not be put on display further. The Declaration was photographed by L.C. Handy in April of 1903, which captured a rather detailed image of the document that has allowed careful comparison of the Declaration as it was in 1903 to how it is today. In 1920, the Secretary of State appointed a new committee to advise in the care and preservation of the founding documents. It was reported that much of the damage to the Declaration was due to being poorly handled prior to their examination. They made the determination that the original documents should be fit for exhibit as long as it was exposed only to diffused light. It was also recommended that the documents be transferred to the Library of Congress. President Warren G. Harding, at the proposal of the Secretary of State, transferred the Declaration to the Library of Congress as they, quote, had experts skilled in archival preservation in a building of modern fireproof construction where the documents, can safely be exhibited to the many visitors that now desire to see them. President Harding issued an executive order, and upon receiving the order, the Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, carried the documents in their large oak frames and nestled them in the library's mail truck, cushioned on a pile of leather mail bags. When they arrived at the Library of Congress, the documents were placed in the librarian's office safe. Herbert Putnam set up the display himself for the Declaration and the Constitution, each displayed behind double panes of glass with yellow gelatin filters that were intended to block harmful light. The documents would be in these displays until 1952. While on display at the Library of Congress in the early 1940s, protein-eating beetles were found in the lower portion of the case where the documents were stored. Also, the documents were at the mercy of uncontrolled humidity, which would have been common in the time before air conditioning unit. From an article titled The Declaration of Independence and the Hand of Time, it is described that when humidity was high, adhesive holding the edges of the Declaration in the display mat softened. Then when the humidity dropped, the parchment contracted and strong tensions between the parchment adhesive and the mat caused the parchment to tear. Guards reported tears at the top right corner of the document. These tears grew longer over time. The early 1940s was also the time of World War II, and after increasing concerns surrounding these founding documents, it was determined that the documents would be transported to Fort Knox in Kentucky. The plans were finalized after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. In November of 1940, there was another detailed look into the condition of the Declaration by conservator George Stout. Stout determined the parchment itself was still firm and strong, but the ink had become dim, either from fading or chalking. This report also mentions the first reporting of a handprint in the lower left-hand corner. This was not seen or described in the prior 1903 condition of the Declaration. Stout's report is also the first to mention large water stains that were also not present in prior examinations. Stout and parchment conservator Evelyn Ehrlich treated the parchment. Old mends and adhesive were removed, and tears and holes were repaired on the back of the document. They filled holes with new parchment and also noted some colored media on some of the signatures, including John Hancock's. I think we should probably go into what exactly parchment is. So parchment is not a paper product, but rather the scraped skins of domesticated animals like sheep or cows. So being a skin, one of the problems with parchment is trying to keep it flat. Due to the material it is made out of, parchment wants to curl up and is very susceptible to changes in humidity. Prior to our modern understanding of preservation, the Declaration was kept flat by lacing string mounts along the border of the parchment, leaving permanent Y-shaped punctures along the edge. While it was on display at the Library of Congress, they had used mounting glue on all four corners to hold the parchment in place. But this resulted in tears as the parchment contracted. Now the parchment is held down with non-abrasive polyester film tabs. It applies a light pressure to the edges to keep the document flat, but does not cause any additional harm to the document. The most significant damage to the document happened between the years 1903 and 1940. Within that time span, a mysterious handprint arrived in the bottom left-hand corner, its origination still unknown. Some type of water damage occurred, creating the tide lines in the center of the document. And now some text is even considered illegible. Someone even enhanced some of the signatures, like John Hancock's. This is a considerable amount of alteration to a document that had been otherwise in fair enough condition for its first 125 years. The Declaration is currently on display in the rotunda of the National Archives. I actually went to Washington, D.C. about 2 years ago, and I had the chance to see these founding documents in person. I will admit, I was shocked at first to see just how faded the text was on the original document. Like many, I was familiar with the document in its copied form. Even in its faded state, seeing the document in person is still one of the most memorable experiences from this trip to Washington, D.C. If you ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend going to see these documents in person. It is hard to convey in words what it feels like to see a document that holds such a powerful and important place in our country's history. Sources for today's episode include an article from the National Archives written by Lynn Ritzenthaler and Catherine Nicholson titled The Declaration of Independence and the Hand of Time, an article from WordPress titled William Godwin's Wet Transfer Copies and James Watt's Copying Machine by Pamela Clemit, and an article from the Nebraska State Historical Society titled The Power of Parchment. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me at It's a History Podcast on Instagram and Threads. Thank you again for listening to today's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.